Hi, Colin. It's great to see you. It was a long time when I wanted to talk with you about negativity and toxic positivity. I will introduce you. Colin Wright is an associate professor of critical theory at University of Nottingham and the head of Department of Cultural Media and Visual Studies there. He has psychoanalytic practice in Nottingham, and he is a member of the London Society of the New Lacanian School, which is great. So I was for a while amazed by how you use the concept of toxic positivity and how you work with the concept of negativity, because you claim that you approach the negativity from psychoanalytically approaching it from psychoanalytic point of view. How do you do that? What does the negative means for you in this context?
Thanks for having me, first of all, Julie. Great to speak to you on this topic. I think partly to answer that question, it would be helpful to make a distinction between dominant discourse, how negativity is spoken about in common everyday discourse, and then I'll maybe say a little bit about analytic discourse to start to try to make some distinctions between those two, because it's a big topic, isn't it? Negativity, it means so many things. It's semantically rather broad. So yeah, to start off with the sort of dominant discourse, that is why I use this term, and not just me, quite a few other people use this phrase toxic positivity to talk about a kind of culture today in which everyone's pretty negative about negativity. Everyone's down on being down, you know? So toxic positivity, it's partly about this sort of obligation to always accentuate the positive and deny one's own negativity, by which I mean, you know, your bad moods, your doubts, your anxiety, your suffering. And I think this is sort of written into social life in quite a ritualized way. I don't know whether you experience this, but certainly in the UK, we have this sort of daily social tick where we meet people and people, maybe acquaintances, and we say, "How are you?" And we don't really mean it because you're supposed to say, "I'm fine, you know, thanks, all is well." But what you don't do is turn around and say, "Well, you know, I'm feeling really low because this happened or that happened." This would be socially a bit awkward because the implicit contract is to have this sort of exchange of pleasantries and positive affect. The other place, I guess, to look for that would be social media, right? That it's quite obvious there that people are enjoined to perform their best lives, you know, show all the fun that they're having. So in this sort of culture, I think, you know, to be sad is to have failed in your duty to be happy somehow. Or, you know, to be a bit of a mess is to fail to have lived up to the obligation to be efficient and productive. Or to be off work, you know, sick, is to fail to have been resilient or have grit. So we are in that sort of a culture, I think, where the negative is, in a way, banned in a certain context. I think as well within dominant discourse, there's a strange movement happening between pathologization and depathologization. What I mean by that is things like, you know, doubt, anxiety, sadness, depression, those still are pathologized for sure. And they're things that are meant to be addressed by medicine, psychiatry, psychopharmacology, so pills. And people are made to feel like it's a bit of a personal kind of moral failing. So that, I think that still exists. But at the same time, we also have this kind of countervailing movement where there's a kind of depathologization as well of some of those old pathologizing labels. to the point that people seem to use those labels as kind of props for their identity, and even props for identities that are to be celebrated. So, one obvious area to think about there would be everybody knows about this like exponential increase in diagnoses of autism and ADHD, and people really now wear these labels as part of their identity, so might introduce themselves that way. Hi, I'm Fred, I'm neurodivergent. It's somehow part of an identity which is no longer pathologized. And on the one hand, I mean, that seems better than the old sort of stigmatizing medical pathologization. But I do think it has also had the effect, in a way, of evacuating the language of suffering, or the negative language around suffering, in favor of this kind of celebration of difference. One example that occurs to me is, in disability studies, you have activists who make the case for the phrase differently abled as in preference to disabled. And it's part of this argument about the social construction of disability, which I really understand the politics of, but at the same time, there's something maybe lost for the disabled person in terms of articulating their frustration, their struggles living in a sort of ableist world when things are sort of flattened with this idea of difference. So I think that's all something complicated happening in the dominant discourse, where negativity is sort of has lost a lot of its purchase, and in some ways is kind of socially unacceptable, including in sort of progressive circles in certain ways. So I'd contrast that then with the analytic discourse. So as a psychoanalyst, I think negativity has a completely different value there, because in a way, in psychoanalysis, you try to find a language precisely for one's suffering, to invent that language. And it all begins with some kind of negativity, right? People enter analysis always with a complaint. Something isn't working. My life's a mess. Things are bad. I feel terrible. And otherwise, why on earth would you go to see a psychoanalyst? So it all begins under that heading of some sort of negativity that's addressed to an analyst. But at the same time, I think there's an additional step in analysis where the complaint that you bring, maybe you know it already really well. You might know it all too well. So sometimes people begin an analysis with a phrase like, why do I keep doing that? There's a sense that there's a repeating pattern in my life and it's negative for me. But what they don't know is what is insisting in that repetition. And so knowing that there is this negative pattern on its own doesn't seem to make any difference to the fact that it repeats. So I think there's something also about, in analysis, the negativity of the complaint or the symptom starts to become, in a way, a positive, in the sense that it's a question: what is this? So in a certain way, in psychoanalysis, the complaint, the negativity, takes on a sort of positive value, which is linked to some kind of truth. Not an easy truth, though. So I'm aware of falling into traps already, which is implying or mentioning this kind of dialectical reversal of the negative into the positive in analytic discourse could sound like a happy ending, some sort of positivity that would be the same as the one in the dominant discourse. That's not at all what I'm talking about, because I think no one should be under any illusions that subjective truth necessarily brings happiness. In fact, it's often, as Al Gore said, his famous documentary, it's inconvenient. But I think there's some positive value to negativity in the analytic discourse because it's linked to a truth that you're willing to pursue, even though it's difficult and full of anxiety and frustration. So I'd emphasize that difference between the dominant discourse and analytic discourse with negativity and what we do with it.
That's beautiful reply, and comprehension of both the stigmatization of suffering and how psychoanalysis is different, but also the problem with depathologizing suffering, which is I partially belong to. And it can be said that I'm celebrating depression, for example, and associating with this. And it's true, I agree with you that it's better than pathologization, but nonetheless, it's still within the framework of, you can say, toxic positivity, because even or the stigmatization of depression, of sadness, it would be still within the context of positivity, because this is what will make us feel good. We will discover truths of who we are, and it will in the context of well-being. So it's not necessary, it doesn't work that well. There is still the need of psychoanalysis, even though it's hard to comprehend what psychoanalytic perspective implies here, where it stands. But precisely because of this this problematic side of psychoanalysis, at least it outside of the whole, problematic dialectical thinking, has its own dialectical problems, but nonetheless, it's outside of the pathologization, depathologization, which once again, the second one for me is much better. So that's great. And maybe psychoanalysis is also different in how it comprehends negativity, because Seligman, who hates psychoanalysis, for him, for positive psychology and for our common sense, negativity is something to be turned into positivity, something foreign, something horrible, something we should get rid of. And for psychoanalysis, it's something different, even the opposite, in comprehension how subject is formed, in comprehension how society works. So what is this difference between comprehension of negativity in Seligman positive psychology and our common sense today, and psychoanalytic one, Lacanian maybe?
I think a lot has to do with maybe an idea of a kind of constitutive negativity in the Lacanian view of the subject. Because, so you're right, Seligman has talked about psychoanalysis as a rotten to the core doctrine. So he doesn't like it because it's really the opposite of his view of the subject, or the individual, maybe we could say the psychological individual. And so I think his version of positive psychology comes out of a very American long tradition of sort of character strengths and can-do optimism and energy. And so the version of the individual that he has in mind really does have quite a kind of historical and cultural rooting, even though, of course, psychology tends to universalize these things as if everybody's like that. But what it doesn't have is that constitutive negativity. It's the opposite. Everything begins with positivity. And you can see that, for example, it's not perhaps known enough that his version of positive psychology and happiness studies too comes out of his work on learned helplessness, which was rooted in rather brutal behavioral psychological experiments electrocuting dogs. So there's something strange about that dark origin for positive psychology, but it is the case. And so the whole experimental apparatus there, which I guess would have been the 60s for Seligman doing that kind of work, was let's start with animals and introduce a negativity in the form of these electric shocks. And that way we can show that those dogs that have been electrocuted learn or actually misapprehend their situation such that even when there is no electric shock, or rather when there is an electric shock but they can escape it, they don't. So they choose to remain in their abject state. So that view of things is everything starts off great, then a bad thing happens and you misrecognize the consequences of that bad thing. But for Seligman, the good news would be, but that's okay, we can relearn that. So it's rooted in that idea of a kind of negative cognitive bias that we can unlearn, which is why in the 90s in particular, he sort of turned, if you like, he turned the frown of his learned helplessness work upside down into the smile of his positive psychology work. It's the same logic, but just turned upside down. Whereas from a Lacanian perspective, you begin really with the negative. I suppose another place to look for that quite obviously with Seligman's work would be post-traumatic growth.
Mm-hmm.
Immediately you can see there's a very different view of trauma. From a psychoanalytic point of view, in a way, subjectivity is always already traumatic. It's too late. It's happened.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Seligman's paradigm suggests that it's a sort of external contingent thing that accidentally hits the subject. But don't worry, we can kind of turn it around into an opportunity for example, increasing your capacity for resilience.
Mm-hmm. So while for positive psychology and happiness studies, there is post-traumatic growth, for Lacan, it's just post-traumatic, full stop, because the subject is post-traumatic as such. So it's just the interruption without adding any growth. And it's kind of obvious, but still, why capitalism and neoliberal society would embrace this kind of logic, and in a level of not only individual, but that you have to turn everything negative, all the life crises into growth or straight, but also on the level of society where we work on comprehend every crisis as the opportunity for improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose capitalism is that mode of production that has found a way to apparently turn loss into profit. So in a way, that movement of minus into plus is what capitalism specializes in. And so to produce the kinds of individuals who see themselves that way makes them more sort of frictionless when it comes to what capitalism wants of consumers, essentially. So yes, the economic crises aren't really crises for capitalism. They're, or rather, they're not crises of capitalism. They are opportunities for capitalists often.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we saw a lot of this around the 2008 credit crunch, when some people said, oh, this is a major moment when the promises of neoliberalism have been broken. The system's going to have to be completely different from now on. And in fact, that didn't turn out to be the case. It was more a moment of the sort of re-entrenchment of neoliberal values, because it was able to sort of prescribe itself as the solution to the problem it had caused. And so there's always this sort of recuperation of crises as opportunities for capitalism. So we get this kind of equivalent on the individual level, where individuals are also expected to turn all the difficulties of their lives to their own profit in some way. And even to the point, I think, of almost valorizing existing on the edge of survivability, because capitalism has made a kind of a sort of precarity as a kind of ontological state. So for individuals to flourish there, they have to be these incredibly adaptive, flexible, neoliberal subjects who can reinvent themselves constantly, and become something else all the time. And so that's, I think, why this sort of happiness studies, positive psychology discourse has meshed so easily with the values of neoliberalism. And it has been taken on as a sort of tool of statecraft as well. It's not just in popular culture, it's something that states actually use as sort of technologies of the self.
Mm-hmm. And we cannot even imagine existence without capitalism. And maybe psychoanalysis and the critical function of psychoanalysis in our ability to at least imagine something new outside, something non-capitalistic in a way.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I'm a bit sort of wary of that idea in that, as you know, Freud said that psychoanalysis is not a Weltanschauung, it's not a worldview.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways, it remains somewhat modest. However, I do think that one of the effects of undergoing an analysis is to extract something of one's own subjectivity that doesn't lend itself to being positivized by the market. There's something negative from the point of view of what markets try to turn into some sort of exchangeable utility. So in a way, for example, the symptoms that we bring to analysis, they're annoying, often because they get in the way of all these other things we're supposed to do as good capitalist subjects who work hard and are productive and so on. But perhaps it can turn out that this stubborn kind of residue of a leftover from these processes of sort of neoliberal individuation, they're ours in a way that doesn't lend itself to this process of sort of positivization. Whether you can then build that up into some sort of alternate political imaginary, I think is a different question. But in that sense, I think psychoanalysis is Lacan always prefers the term subversion, doesn't he? Not revolutionary, but subversive. And I think that's probably accurate.
In this way, maybe the opposite of optimism, especially American style optimism of positive psychology and all the psychologization of society, is psychoanalytic pessimism, the other reason to hate psychoanalysis. Also, not only on individual level, but both on the level of society, or at least more modesty. Well, it's the optimism that is so modest that it's pessimism, maybe.
So it kind of turns full circle.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And this acceptance of the negative, or when you start with the negative, it might be the pessimistic, and the negative is something that it's there to stay. It might be this positivity, which is not particularly appealing for the contemporary subject, which is the problem of contemporary subject. It's
That's
true.
true. I think in a way, psychoanalysis is an increasingly difficult sell, or it's difficult to sort of market psychoanalysis as an experience because it's very much against the grain of what contemporary subjects expect, including from, quote unquote, therapy, which I would say psychoanalysis is not.
What is it then?
It's an experience. I mean, the reason I say it's not a therapy is to try to distinguish it from this sort of omnipresent therapeutic discourse, which is absolutely part and parcel of that toxic positivity that I was talking about, where, it's full of this sort of discourse of authenticity, of self-expression, of freedom, autonomy, and it kind of promises, yes, a happiness, or at least a release from suffering, which, going back to your point about psychoanalytic pessimism, it seems an irresponsible promise to make. Better not to make promises you can't keep, I would say. So, and the other point about therapy is that either it promises to return you to a pre-existing state of functioning, which is inherently normative and doesn't really value what of the novel and the new and the unprecedented can appear thanks to an analysis. So you're not going back to the way you were as a goal, but maybe something else will happen. So that's one part of this sort of therapeutic ethos. So I think it's important that, Lacan said, I think it's in Seminar 7, isn't it, that Lacan says happiness is a bourgeois myth that psychoanalysts should have nothing to do with. And I think it was good advice, even though the therapeutic sort of industry makes a lot of money promising that. Psychoanalysis tries not to fall into that sort of trap. And that's why I'm saying it's not a therapy in that sense of the therapeutic ethos, which is everywhere and really problematic, I think.
It's also problematic maybe to call it experience, because therapy is problematic for obvious reasons, because it's a therapy in conventional understanding and aims at cure and improving and well-being and all the positive things. But the trick that existential therapy they would say that it's not, there are two etymological meanings, not only of therapy, not only cure, but also attendance, like caring, being there. And they would say that this is what they do, which is still quite positive because you're caring and it's still kind of improving, but they don't offer cure. There is more acceptance of the negative. And I would still call psychoanalysis therapy, but in a meaning of care, but like end of life care, meaning, or the question, what do you care about? If the person is essentially negative, the subject is essentially negative, to care for the subject is to care for negativity, so end of life care is interesting thing, because does it care about the end of life? No matter how much you care about the person, it won't improve them. It's very wasteful. It's not improving, but you still have to do it. You still have to be there witnessing their suffering, or not sharing suffering, but in the negativity, or this idea of embracing the lack, or sharing the lack, the nothingness, something like that. And I would also call them patience, because patience means that the subject etymologically is suffering. An idea of the patient of a therapy is that they're suffering, so you're supposed to make them better, but it doesn't apply necessarily. They're just suffering. That's it. And with experience, it's interesting because in a similar way, because experience is used in common sense psychology, in conventional psychology, as something to sell, something to improve. one's life to, to as the commodity experiences, but this idea maybe of experience of non-experience, of the opposite, which is the actual thing and the actual novelty for the world of experience as commodity, the non-experience, the nothingness rather. Um,
Mm.
so
Yes, I think
psychoanalysis is both. It's non-therapy and non-experience.
yes, I mean, of course, these terms have been commodified so much that it's some work is required to separate them out. I think Lacan emphasizes this notion of experience partly to separate psychoanalytic theory out from its practice.
Mhm.
In other words, opening yourself up to the encounter with the analyst is an experience that no amount of reading Lacan or Freud or Winnicott or Klein or whoever would sort of prepare you for, because you implicate yourself in that experience. But I definitely take your point that by definition, it's not an experience that you can easily represent to yourself. There's that phrase in English anyway about chalk it up to experience, meaning, oh, just put it down to what you already know. Whereas one would hope for more from the analytic experience.
So what is the work of the negative? If psychoanalysis is the work of the negative, what would this work be?
Well, maybe going back to what I was saying earlier, that an early part, if we can think of it chronologically, though that's probably already wrong, of that work of negativity would be that turn of the complaint towards a sort of transference to, if you like, the truth in one's own symptom. So I think that's already an important work of the negative where, and it propels the analysis, because there's something very peculiar about analysis. It doesn't promise happiness. Sometimes it makes you feel better. Often it doesn't. And it's tough. It's full of anxiety. It's really frustrating, but something pushes you on. And so there's some sort of stubbornness about that negativity that moves an analysis onwards. I'd also say one of the aspects of the negative in analysis is circling around something you can't say. So I think a common assumption about therapy is that it gives you this light bulb insight where you can say, aha, and then say in a sentence one's own subjective truth. But in analysis, the negative is close to the real, which can't be symbolized, meaning that you circle around something that really cannot be said. And a product of psychoanalysis includes that, I think, that there's a negativity in the sense of something unsayable, something unteachable, untransmissible, which again is quite a difficult sell today, when I think part of the positivity of positive psychology, for example, is a kind of positivism of, I'm not even going to say representation really, because it's more to do with something like statistics. Everything is supposed to be captured. All of experience is meant to be reducible to data. And that's a sort of common idea. And in fact, shapes certain types of therapeutic modalities. I mean, in some ways, CBT, with its emphasis on numbers, performs something of this reduction of experience to data, which works very well for its sort of evidence base, but I think misses something really crucial about subjectivity, which in the end is sort of unsayable. So I think that's another part of the negativity of it, is of analysis, is that we have to give up on that, perfect sentence that says the truth of everything.
Mhm. That's a great answer. Hopefully won't scare those who are not familiar with Lacanian psychoanalysis away. But um, to go back a little bit and to maybe simplified language, it's tempting to ask people who are theorists in psychoanalysis or in philosophy, and those who are practicing it, especially too. But there is uh, something behind the person, behind the theory and theorizing. And so, you as a person, what is your, as a person that exists in the society of toxic positivity, what is your personal, I don't know, inspiration, or the opposite of inspiration, a personal problem with the toxic positivity, or why are you analyst, for example, and how it influences your well-being?
Yeah, I mean, that last question I think is too big for me to answer. Why am I an analyst? But I could mention maybe just a couple of anecdotes about like moments when what I have come to call toxic positivity really bothered me.
Mhm.
So one was just a teaching experience. So obviously I teach in a university. This is going back quite a way, but I remember teaching to first year undergraduate students, so young people, trying to begin to teach something about basically Marxist ideology critique and using, in a way, the very obvious and famous scene from The Matrix. You already know what I'm going to say, but it's the red pill or the blue pill scene where Morpheus offers to this character Neo the red pill or the blue pill and tells him that the red pill will show him a truth which it is implied is maybe a bit shocking and horrific, or the blue pill, which is just to return to life as you know it, and importantly, to forget that there was this other option of the red pill.
Mhm.
And I always just got students to, show of hands, red or blue. And I just had to stop doing it after a couple of years because, not surprisingly, there were very few votes for the red pill. Everybody put their hand up for the blue pill. And when I asked why, they would say things like, ignorance is bliss.
Mhm.
And it's a very coherent position. So that's the first thing to say. It's not irrational, this response of those students. But it really made me reflect on myself because for some difficult to explain reason, I'm a red pill guy.
Mhm.
Something about truth matters to me. And probably that's one of the reasons why I've just been talking about truth as a sort of value in an analysis. But it's a challenge when basically I could feel in the culture a shift where people prefer happiness to truth. And there's something of an incompatibility between those two things. So already there was a sense that, oh, this positivity, this preference for the positive is actually a major challenge to some of the things I'm quite invested in. For example, critical theory, Marxism, psychoanalysis. It's difficult to work with people who just say, no, no, I prefer ignorance because it makes me happy. And it was essentially the ignorance of consumption as well. That's worth saying. So that was one experience. Another one was I was at a research event when there was a psychotherapist. He was from California, so he was a certain kind of psychotherapist who to me seemed a bit more like a life coach. And he talked about in his clinical practice prescribing films to help people therapeutically. And he played a clip from the very well-known film La Vita è Bella, the Life is Beautiful film, which I'm sure you know is about Italian Jews and being taken to a concentration camp, and the main character, to try to protect his son, turns this dreadful situation into a kind of a game. And the person presenting this film, he showed a clip where this game was invented and then said, so the lesson of that is that you can maintain your grit and resilience even in the most trying of circumstances. And I was absolutely horrified because the whole of European anti-Semitism, the rise of Hitler, racism, all of that social, political, historical context was sort of spirited away, and it was turned into this very individualized psychology. And as a sort of arts and humanities person, it really didn't sit well with me regarding, I guess, the kind of understanding of humanity in that presentation. Maybe I'll mention one last thing was while I was engaged in industrial action and standing on the picket line as an academic, protesting certain things happening in universities. In my university, they set aside a well-being room at exactly the same time, which was it had coloured bean bags, probably some scented candles, some relaxing music, and it was quite clearly a kind of a cynical move that was again responsibilizing or individualizing members of staff. You cannot be unhappy because we have a well-being room and we look after you and you have the option of going to relax there. Clearly massively ignoring structural structural inequalities, problems with the commodification of the university experience, etc., etc. So those are probably enough to indicate, moments where I've thought, this is a bit of a problem. But I think everybody recognizes it because it's ubiquitous now, isn't it? This toxic positivity. Probably lots of people have had those, I don't know, team building exercises in the workplace, which are perfectly awful and I think unbearable. And most people don't like them at all. But they're all about increasing morale, and so this is seeped into the fabric of everyday life. I think lots of people will have their own examples, no doubt.
Yeah, I think it's true. It's first of all personal encounter with the certain manifestations of toxic positivity, and then you theorize it into make a theory out of it. But on the other hand, for me, once when I'm encountering it, it's super irritating. I would try to avoid it. I wouldn't like those people and those structures that represent it. But once you are kind of in a place free from it a bit, in Ireland, it's not that bad here, it's not cynical, and it's actually mean when they care about you and ask how you are. It's surprisingly still, I hope, means something. But from the distance, for me now, toxic positivity doesn't seem that bad. And this, when one is opting for ignorance, I think that's the might be the other side of the contrary of something opposite, acceptance of negativity, which is manifested as toxic positivity. And I'm thinking about Kierkegaard here, perspective that everything is despair, including happiness, including this, especially this pursuit, American pursuit of happiness, that because they know what they're escaping from, because they're not ignorant, that's how they would prefer ignorance. And it's not really up to them to decide that much, because we are more maybe in touch with our negative core, because maybe it's more obvious, and the horror of existence in general. That's why there is this need, or despair of pursuit of happiness and despair. So that's how I tolerate people, positive people. I'm just thinking that this is how they're desperate, and it's even more desperate. There's something horrifying, and especially when you mentioned this example with dogs, as the opposite perspective is actually based on the opposite of not pursuit of happiness, not out of the happiness, but on there is something negative in different ways, but there is still more there is still more style, better style in psychoanalysis than in, if both are accepting, if both are embracing in a way or dealing with negativity, then there is more style, and the psychoanalysis more genuine than positive way of doing it. It's more truthful in a way, probably. But nonetheless, it's interesting to see how what will happen in the future.
Yeah, I think I like what you said about this sort of slightly desperate use of happiness as a kind of acknowledgement of a core of negativity. Because if there's this sort of loud, clamoring demand for happiness, it effectively spells out that we're not that happy, right? It's always got that kind of logic to it. But I think one of the differences with psychoanalysis is that demand for happiness we can take in a direction that's not the same as the sort of medicalizing, commodified solutions offered by the market, for example. So it can take that demand for happiness in a kind of unexpected direction and produce something different. Lacan said, I can't really remember where, but I remember him saying, the phallus, or only the phallus is happy, not its bearer. I think it's a way of saying that because the phallus is a signifier that belongs to the other, sorry to speak in these Lacanian terms, but it's a way of saying that actually quite often today the market enjoys our supposed happiness more than we do. Whereas I think psychoanalysis is capable of doing something different with this demand for happiness. And that can include accommodating our own negativity better.
It was amazing talking to you. I hope we can talk again. And it was great to have you and discussing all of those things. Thank you, Colin. Hope to see you again.
Thank you, Julie. You got me thinking about many different things, so I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Colin.